So it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Thomas Hylland Eriksen, whose work I've long admired. Thomas, when and where were you born?
I was born in Oslo, Norway, in 1962.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The next question is always about your ancestors. Mm-hmm. My last Chinese subject went back to 2,700 years ago to his first Deng ancestor, and others have gone back to the Norman conquest. But usually people go back to their grandparents or that sort of generation, anyone who they think might have influenced them. So can you tell me something about your ancestry?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously in my part of the world we have a cognatic kinship, so we have ancestors on both our mother's and our father's side. Mm-hmm. And the Hylland bit, or Hylland as we say in Norwegian, is on my mother's side. Mm-hmm. Hylland is a farm in central southern Norway, in Telemark County, in the very heartlands, you might say, of what would eventually become Norwegian national romanticism, which many have pointed out is a bit of an irony, since I have often written critically about this particular strain of Norwegian nationalism. So they were farmers in a mountain farm in southern Norway, but they migrated. So my grandfather on my mother's side, he was an engineer, migrated to Canada in the 1930s with his young daughter and wife. His young daughter would eventually become my mother, and worked in Canada for a little while before returning to Europe just in time for the Second World War, where he was active in the resistance, going back and forth to Sweden and being sort of an accomplice in some of the sabotage actions against the Nazi Germans and so on and so forth. And he died before I was born, but I grew up with stories about my maternal grandfather, who was clearly a man of some significance, big personality, founder of an engineering company which is still very healthy back home in Norway and so on. So my mother, in other words, she came from what was by then an urban bourgeois middle-class family from Oslo, and very much sort of anchored in this Norwegian, as was central Norwegian farming culture. Whereas with my father, on my father's side, I have a completely different story, completely different itinerary, because he was a bit of a Creole from northern Norway. He grew up as a working class boy in the city of Tromsø. You know, the northernmost university in the world, they say, is in Tromsø. It's really very far north, but thanks to the Gulf Stream, it's livable. You know, barely you can survive there. He had a working class background, mixed Norwegian and Sami and probably something else ancestry. He was very tall and very dark and looked a bit like an Italian mafioso, you might say.
You haven't had his DNA done.
Yes, but he was very much a self-made man, coming from very modest upbringing, and turned himself into, at first a journalist, then a newspaper editor, and eventually he became a UNESCO expert in Africa on rural press. So he had quite an eventful life. So I would say that my father, who died when I was still at school, I mean, many years ago, I was 17 when he died of cancer, and he was a major influence on me. I mean, his curiosity, his love of everything different, his love of hot tropical climates and different foods and people, and he really liked it. He fell in love with Africa.
And he was a reader as well. Did he read much?
Oh yes, voraciously. Because, you know, at the time, in the working class household in a country like Norway, typically they would have a handful of books. You know, they would have a Bible, a copy of the royal sagas written by Snorre Sturluson, the Icelandic author of the late Middle Ages, which was an important sort of contributor to modern Norwegian nationalism and national identity, the Viking kings, and maybe 2 or 3 other books. So when he finally could afford to buy books, he never stopped. You know, so our house was filled with books, all kinds of books. So he read, I mean, everything he could get his hands on.
Well, tell me something about your mother's personality and how it might have influenced you as well.
Yes, my mother, who died only last year, she was a school teacher. She was also an intellectually engaged person, active in politics, at first in the Liberal Party, and then she realized that she had more in common with the with the Social Democrats, so she became a Labour politician and sat on the municipal council where we grew up for several years for the Labour Party. And they were both, I mean, both my parents were very generous, encouraging people. We had a modern, liberal, free upbringing. My brother and I have an older brother who's a professor of biology. And so when we grew up, we could do pretty much as we liked. And we were encouraged no matter what we did. And we were taken on trips. Other Norwegians might go to the mountains to go skiing when there was a school break in winter, whereas my parents took me to London, or us to London, because they were infatuated with some aspects of British culture, notably theatre, but also musicals. So we went there every year. And so yes, I mean, I would say that I had a happy childhood. I was brought up by caring, loving parents with considerable interests in the outside world, so we had good conversations about what was going on in the United States and what was going on in Africa over Sunday dinner.
Lovely. Sounds great. Well, we'll go into it in a little more detail, but was it from a religious background? Were they any Protestant denomination or anything?
No, it was completely secular. We were a secular family. I mean, my brother and I were baptized in church, but that was probably because of tradition. I mean, this was after all the early 1960s, and out of consideration perhaps for older relatives. No, it was very secular. I mean, I don't think anybody in my close kin network had any strong religious inclinations.
So that will answer a later question. Religion hasn't played an important part in your life at all?
Not organised religion, but I've been curious about it, obviously. And obviously later on, when I became an anthropologist, it is a source of some wonder, isn't it? What is going on? What is it that they've understood? And later in life I have befriended a number of theologians, and I've always been impressed by their erudition and their humane intelligence. And so I'm not at all dismissive of religion as I was in my teens, but it never played a part in my childhood. No, we never went to church, not even on Christmas Eve, when many Norwegians go to church because it's tradition.
And so you would now classify yourself as a sort of borderline agnostic atheist?
Yeah, I think that might be a good way of talking about it. I mean, Gregory Bateson's father, the geneticist William Bateson, it is said he read the Bible to his children every Sunday breakfast, so that they would not grow up to be empty-headed atheists. So they should know what they were leaving behind.
Very nice. So tell me, people often haven't thought about it, but what was your first memory? Concrete memory, not just vague, but and at what age?
Yes, that's a good question, and I think it's correct to say that, well, I have two, because you see, we lived in Oslo only until I was about 2, and then we moved up north because my father got a job as an editor with the Labour newspaper in the city of Bodø in northern Norway, where we lived for 4 years. So we returned to southern Norway just in time for me to start school. And we went to a Catholic kindergarten, which was apparently the best in town. That's why they sent us to the Catholic kindergarten. And one of my memories from there, I must have been about 4, and I just learned to read. And I was reading Donald Duck comics. I was sitting on the steps, you know, outside the kindergarten, dressed up in winter clothes, next to a friend of mine whose name was Knut. And I was reading aloud from this Donald Duck comic to him. And I have a very distinct, concrete memory of that, so that must be true. The other memory from around the same time was when I was accompanying, excuse me, my mum to the shop.
Well, have I?
I will, yes. Yeah.
You have amazing memory if you can remember the name of the person you were talking to at the age of 4. Yeah.
Yes, but we haven't stayed in touch. But and my other concrete memory from around the same time, it must have been, I was taken to the grocery with my mum on my way home from kindergarten, and I was made to wait outside while she was inside getting her groceries. And it was bitterly cold, and there was an Arctic gale blowing, and I was so unbelievably cold. And I have often thought later in life that maybe it was that kind of experience that inoculated me against these sort of cold winter activities that many Norwegians engage in, and which I've had difficulties with. Yes.
What was your first school? At what age did you go to your first? This was
yes.
kindergarten, and then afterwards the
yes.
first proper school.
That's right. And by then we had moved south. We did not move to Oslo. We moved to Tønsberg, which is the oldest town in Norway, located about 100 kilometers south of Oslo, along the Oslo fjord. A very good place to grow up, where my dad got another job as an editor of a doomed labour newspaper, eventually. And so I started school at 6. I was a little bit ahead of the others because I really wanted to start school. So I had to pass a test in order to be allowed to start a year before everybody else, because at the time Norwegian children started school at 7. It's now 6, but it was at 7. So I was 6 years old, and yes, we had a primary school at the time. The primary school only contained the 3 first classes. So in other words, only first, second and third primary. And then we moved to another school for the 4th, 5th and 6th. So it's very intimate and very gemeinschaftlich, you might say. You know, we were not on first names with the teachers, but we knew where they lived, and sometimes we knew the children. It was very localized and it was, you know, at the time Norway was very white, very homogeneous in terms of culture. But in terms of class, and that has struck me later in life, reflecting on my own childhood. In terms of class, in small Norwegian communities outside of the big cities like Oslo and Bergen, everybody goes to school with everybody else. Which means that among my schoolmates, I mean, you had the son of an unemployed welder who used to work, I mean, before he was laid off at the local factory. And we had the daughter of the local ship owner. Obviously, I mean, this is a shipping town, so they were obviously incredibly wealthy. Had several cars even in the 1960s and so on. So that exposed you to a certain kind of diversity, but within a very sort of enclosed, you might say, conformist world. The world was much less diverse in the 60s and early 70s than it would later become, both in terms of ethnicity and in terms of other things.
Were there any things around, I mean, you're 6, 7, 8, that you are particularly passionate about or interested in? Hobbies, games, collecting, reading comics, whatever?
Yes, yeah, I did read comics. Okay? I did read Donald Duck comics and continued to do so for a number of years. But yes, I mean, I think there's a certain kind of children, and I was probably one of them, who early on developed a passion for astronomy and dinosaurs, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I did have that, and which would soon lead to an interest in science fiction literature. Around that time. I mean, among the comics I read when I was about 7, 8 years was Superman, for example. So that kind of world, this world that somehow transcends the tedium of the everyday, had a great attraction for me at the time.
What about outdoor activities? Did you fish or explore woods with your friends or things like that?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I didn't just stay at home in the basement reading comics and reading about dinosaurs. No, I did have friends, and we did go out. And the thing is that as I grew up along the coast, and at the time, parents, certainly my parents, had a much more relaxed relationship. They were much less worried, it seems to me, for the children than parents are nowadays. Certainly much less worried than I was when I had kids that age. So we were just left to our own devices much of the time from a very early age. We got on our bikes and went out, and in summer we went swimming, and in winter we might go into the forest and look for some way of performing some mischievous act of some kind of the other. But the most important thing about that particular part of Norway is that a very large number of people have boats. I mean, it's a boating culture. It was a whaling town. It was shipping, and not so much fishing in that part of the country. That's mostly in the west and north. So we also had a small boat, At first just a rowing boat, but we could go out on the fjord and go to some little island and go swimming. So those are some of my fondest memories. And in winter, there was a bit of ice skating. In that part of the country we didn't get much snow, or it didn't settle. It was too mild. So skiing was never an important part of my life, but ice skating, yes, we did that. And we could even, I should add that at the time child labour was less taboo than now. So I grew up a bit outside of the town where there were farms nearby, and we could, I mean from the age of 9 or 10, we could earn a little bit of pocket money, you know, by picking strawberries, you know, by harvesting onions, that sort of thing, which was considered perfectly legitimate. Yeah.
Sounds lovely. Then you went on, you did 6 years at sort of primary school.
Yeah.
And so you were about 12 when you went on to the next school.
Yes.
Did you have to take some examination to get into a particular school, or?
No, that is only for secondary school. That is upper secondary. You know, the equivalent of, you know, Form 3 and onwards in the British system. When you're about 16, you have to take exams.
Yeah.
But we went. I mean, I didn't really. I mean, upper primary school or lower secondary. You know, the 7th to the 9th grade. I didn't really take part much here, or rather in Norway, because we moved to Kenya. My dad had projects for the UNESCO, so he was building. He was trying to build rural newspapers, and somehow it resonates a bit with the anthropological way of thinking I have later come to think, because rural Kenyans at the time, we're talking about the mid-1970s, many of them, an increasing number, learned how to read, at least in a rudimentary way. They could read, but they didn't have much to read, and books were too expensive and didn't seem relevant for them. The newspapers that were published in Nairobi were in English, and also didn't really speak to rural people's concerns. So the idea was to produce newspapers which were sold really cheaply, you know, 10p, you know, that sort of price, which engaged with people's local concerns, such as how to clean your drinking water, who has sold goats to whom, you know, that kind of thing. What's happening in the church this coming Sunday? Very basic stuff. So he developed a newspaper in Murang'a, which is a bit north of Nairobi, in the Kikuyu-speaking area, and also a project in Ghana, in West Africa, and elsewhere. So we lived in Nairobi for a couple of years, and I went to school there, which I have since visited on a couple of occasions when I've been in Nairobi, and it's still there and still looks pretty much the same.
And was there a culture shock when do you remember it, when you went to Africa?
Yes, but I was very excited about it. Very excited and full of anticipation. But the odd thing was that we left Norway at the height of summer, in July. It was very hot. And I remember my dad saying to the taxi driver that, you know, yeah, we're going on a long journey, we're on our way to Africa. And the taxi driver sort of laughed and said, well, that means that you'll get hotter weather where you are, even hotter than here. and we also laughed. And coming to Nairobi, this was in the middle of the cold season, and Nairobi is quite high, you know, it's 1,600 meters, so it was 19 degrees and overcast. So it wasn't exactly, that was a bit different from what we'd expected. But regarding the culture shock, I can't really remember a culture shock, only a lot of excitement about being in a different place, where people looked differently, and they spoke different languages, and also going to a school which was quite different from the one I was used to, because Norwegian schools were already then, in the 1970s, quite liberal, and they were quite concerned, you know, with making children feel safe and happy, and you know, that kind of attitude towards education, whereas St. Mary's was run by Irish monks, so it also a Catholic school in Nairobi, was quite authoritarian, quite strict. There was physical punishment, you know, there were very severe sanctions, and there was also ruthless ranking of students. After every major test, you know, there was a list that was displayed publicly of every student, and ranked from 1 to 33 in each class. So everybody could go and have a look and see, so Asamba is doing really badly this term, you know, that sort of thing. In fact, that was more of a shock, I think, than being exposed to Africa, at least the way I remember it.
Did you react negatively to this new hierarchical disciplinarian system? Or?
Yes, I did, but it also, I guess it also awoke a certain competitive spirit in myself. I wanted to do well. I mean, after all, I was about 13, 14, and you're receptive to this kind of influence. But yes, we did talk about it at home. I think, this is a bit different, and it's a shame for those students who always end up on the bottom of the table. So, and there was real competition. We had, in my class at St. Mary's at the time, there was about a third Europeans, a third Africans, and a third Indian, because of the large Indian population in East Africa. And as I remember it, the hierarchy in school, in terms of grades and so on, did not follow ethnic lines at all.
Didn't.
I mean, no, there were African students who were doing really well, and there were some of the Europeans who were doing really badly. So at least there, the colonial spirit was not being reproduced. But this was just a decade or so after independence, for countries like Kenya, 12 years after independence. So it was still very fresh, and there was a lot of optimism, and people really believed in development and progress. So it was a very good time, you might say, to be in Africa. In the 1980s, lots of things would turn sour, and many would stop believing in progress and development. But at the time, there was still a strong feeling. And our teachers also told us so. We had both Indian and European, no African though, Indian and European teachers, Indian Catholics from Goa, taught us math and so on, yes. And they also told us about the way in which Kenya is getting there, we're not quite there yet, but wait for a few decades and we'll be up there, with the Europeans.
Excellent. Were there any teachers you now remember from that school who influenced you particularly, or?
Yes, I had a very good French teacher, and she was, I can't remember her name though, not now, but I might be able to recall it if I try. Yes, my French teacher, because she saw you as an individual, and she saw that some of us had what I would call, special needs in a positive sense, that we needed challenges. Whereas some of the other teachers, they were a bit more aloof, and they were speaking to all of us as one big sort of blob, which was common at the time. Yes.
What about sports? This is about the time you get either very keen or put off by competitive and other sports.
Absolutely. Yes, we did. Yes, yes. I mean, we did engage in obviously games after school. A couple of days a week there were games after school, just like at a regular English school. So I was never very good at hockey. Football was okay with me because I played football. I mean, European football at home. Cricket, I could really never get my head around. It's complicated for an outsider, so I never really got into cricket. But both my brother and I were, and he was a bit better than me actually, but we were on the swimming team. So we were good swimmers. Yeah.
Have you continued with sports through your life at all, or?
I have. Yes, and one of the things I started to do in Kenya, in fact, at St. Mary's, because we had tennis and we had squash courts and so on, I started to play squash. And I continue to do that. So squash has been my game of preference. I also played a bit of tennis in adult life. So I've played squash regularly with an anthropologist friend of mine until very recently, because I fell ill and had to stop doing that sort of thing a couple of years ago.
So you were there for 2 years?
Yes.
And then what happened?
And then we moved back to Norway. My dad continued to work in Africa, but I mean, he sort of commuted, you might say. He spent maybe a month or two, and then he came back. He had a project. When he fell ill and later died, he was working on the project on the freedom of the press in South Africa, and was briefly arrested by the apartheid state. So we were very proud of him. I was then 17 and starting to understand a bit about what was going on in the world. But unfortunately, he never completed that project. And he was just 45.
Was it an illness related to being in Africa, or?
No, it was lung cancer.
Yeah. That must have had quite a shock on.
Yes.
To you.
It was very significant. That kind of sadness which never leaves you. That someone who you've been very close to and you've admired. So I've often thought that so many of the things I've done later in life I've done for him. Because he left us just at the time that my brother and I were becoming adults. But as he said, he knew that he was going to die. But as he said to my aunt, he knew that he had a good life and that he had two boys who were going to be all right. Because you can sometimes see this in adolescents and teenagers, that they're going to stay. He reckoned that we would stay out of trouble and do well. So at least he could reconcile himself with that.
He was at home when he died?
In hospital.
Yeah, back in Norway.
In Norway, that's right. That's right.
You came back to a Norwegian school,
yes.
And were you beginning to specialise in particular subjects and getting interested in one sphere or other?
Yes, I think so, and I think probably the experience in Africa, it's hard to tell what are, I mean, the causality is always complicated, what are the causes? People sometimes tell me that, well, the reason you became an anthropologist is that you lived in Africa as a teenager. I'm not sure, it's not as simple as that. I mean, I had been interested in exploring the world long before, as a child, long before we went to Africa, and there were also other influences. So, yes, I mean, in secondary school, I mean, after returning from Africa, I guess I developed a strong interest in global issues, which would eventually attract me to anthropology. Global injustice, environmental issues, that sort of thing. Anarchism, existentialism. I was also, just like my dad, I'm also a fairly uncritical and voracious reader, so I read all kinds of stuff which I half understood as a teenager. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialists, a lot of English literature, Huxley, Orwell, I mean the usual suspects, but also, I mean, and Graham Greene, but also people like V.S. Naipaul and eventually Salman Rushdie. Yes. So yes, I did develop an interest in global issues, and I did not specialize in the sciences. When I had to make that choice, I took did languages and social sciences instead.
Are you good at languages?
Reasonably. I mean, I have a sort of I say I have passive knowledge of quite a number of languages, in the sense that I can read them. Yeah, but
how many?
Well, Scandinavian. Let's count Scandinavian as well, because they're almost the same.
Well,
Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, English, French, Creole, Mauritian Creole, Spanish, yeah, a bit of German, Italian, yeah. So I mean, I can read most of the main West European languages, but I'm reluctant, to speak most of them unless I have to. But if I have to, I do.
So at what age did you decide to go to university? Was it automatic that you would go to university?
Not really. And we were the first generation. I mean, there's a nice concept in Scandinavia which was introduced a few years ago by a Swedish historian of ideas called Ronny Ambjörnsson. And Ronny is a name in English, in Swedish and Norwegian, which has certain class connotations. If your name is Ronny, you're not upper class, I mean, your dad might have been an unemployed mechanic or something. So, and his book was called My Name is Ronny, and everybody knows what this means. So, and he speaks about the class journey, what he calls a class journey, which was something that took place in all over the West, I think, after the Second World War, in the sense that children were better educated than their parents. So, at the time when I completed secondary school in 1980. About half of the Norwegian 18-year-olds took that particular exam. Others took vocational training or something else, which was theoretically oriented. About half. And 10 years later, half of the Norwegian population went to university. So there's been this enormously fast development of higher education in the country, which is often not commented upon, because it has had some serious, implications for the kind of society we have. So no, it was not automatic that I should go to university, but it was expected. I mean, by my parents, eventually by my mum, that I probably will. My parents didn't have much by way of formal education. I mean, my dad had 1 year of something called the Journalist Academy, It was a kind of polytechnic 1-year training as a journalist, and then he was just sent out into the world to make his career. And my mother had 3 years of teachers' college, and that was it. So, but both my brother and I went to university, and he did informatics and biology and math and physics, and I did sociology, philosophy and anthropology. And at the time you took 1 year of each subject, so you actually got to read quite a bit. When you took philosophy, you actually got to read a bit of Kant and Hegel and do it seriously, because you had a full year of just
In what order did you do them?
I took sociology first, and then anthropology, and I cheated a bit because I took the first year anthropology in just 1 semester. I was a bit rushed, wanted to finish, and then philosophy afterwards, before returning to anthropology. But it had not really been my ambition to become an academic. I never thought that I'd be an academic.
Which you went to Oslo?
To Oslo University, yes.
Yes.
I did everything at Oslo University. We didn't have any exchange programs at the time. When I'd finished the equivalent of the bachelor degree,
Let's pause on the university a bit more. Were there any teachers at Oslo who particularly inspired you in any of those 3 subjects?
Absolutely. But I should, before I answer, I should also say that I had not really intended to stay at university. I mean, I had no idea what I was going to do. I was a kind of late hippie type, with ecological and anarchist inclinations, and I thought maybe I'd be a writer or a development worker or something like that. So going to university was just something I planned to do for a little while sorting out what I really wanted to do in the world. And here we are, 30 odd years on, nearly 40 years on, and I'm still there in the same university, same building. So there must have been something right about it. And the teachers were part of the reason. In sociology, we had some fabulous teachers, and I mean, Hylland and Aubert, these are well-known figures in Norway. One of the leading sociologists of law in the country, and a very good microsociologist who taught us Goffman and interaction, the theory and that sort of thing. We had Dag Østerberg, who was the main interpreter of Sartre and of continental social philosophy in the country, who taught us Max Weber, Durkheim and the classics in ways which probably nobody else would have been capable of doing at the time. And the third teacher in sociology was a man who is still with us. He's very old now, called Stein Bråten, who does some very innovative work in, you might say, in the interface between psychology, development psychology, and sociology, where he argues against theories of people like Sigmund Freud and Jean Piaget about child development in a very fascinating way. So we have these really 3 fabulous teachers in sociology. In anthropology, I obviously also had teachers who mattered much to me, several of whom later became my colleagues.
What Frederick Barth?
Yeah, I was going to say something about this, because everybody asks me that question. Obviously, since I later worked with ethnicity and nationalism, it is often assumed that I was one of his students, but he didn't have any students as such in Oslo. Frederick Barth was in Bergen in the 1960s until the early 70s, where he developed, the Bergen School of Social Anthropology. It's very much shaped by his ideas and his method. But in Oslo, he had a chair at the Ethnographic Museum, not at the Department of Social Anthropology. It's just down the road. I mean, it's 4 stops on the tram. Very near physically, but very, very distant in other ways. He had no teaching obligations at the department, and relationships between Frederick Barth and the Department of Social Anthropology were also not very good. I mean, there were some tensions there, okay? So we didn't really know him well, but when the students asked him, which we did sometimes, to come and give a lecture, he always obliged, he always came. He spoke without a manuscript and was always brilliant, charismatic, and mesmerizing. But he was not a major influence on me. And the thing is that when I was an undergraduate, I was highly critical of Frederick Barth. I mean, I had by then already been shaped or influenced by continental social philosophy. It's a very different way of approaching the world. I felt much closer intellectually to people like Levi Strauss and Mary Douglas The structural functionalists, the structuralists, the people who reckon that people were, or persons were the products of society and not the other way around. Whereas Frederick's methodological individualism, his transactionalism, seemed to us, not the right way of approaching things, a rational actor approach, for which he was still famous, a bit unjustly because he had then moved on. So no, he was not. I mean, one major influence on me at the time, when I was an undergraduate student, was Eduardo Archetti, who died some years ago, originally from Argentina, and who taught us structural Marxism, structuralism. He had studied with Godelier in Paris, so he brought that strain of anthropology into Oslo in a very significant way. And he was also, Eduardo Archetti was also very imaginative. He was good with metaphors. So he was a liberating force, you might say, to think with. So he was important. Another important teacher for me was Axel Sommerfeld, who had been a student of Max Gluckman. So he had worked in Southern Africa. He had worked at the University of Salisbury in the 1960s before being thrown out by Ian Smith in 1966 because he sided with the students during the unilateral declaration of independence for White Rhodesia. So Axel Sommerfeld, who was an Africanist, and he was my supervisor, both for my MPhil and later for my PhD. Also very important. He was very reasoned. He didn't publish much. He hardly published anything at all, apart from book reviews. But he was very learned. He knew everything. He had read everything, and he followed, the recent developments in Africanist anthropology. And the third teacher, who was also a lasting influence on me, was Harald Eidheim, who was probably one of the people who influenced Fredrik Wa's thinking about ethnicity. Harald Eidheim had worked in the far north of Norway on Sami-Norwegian ethnic relations. And one of the things that he discovered was that there doesn't have to be much by way of cultural difference for there to be ethnicity. I mean, everybody in this village, in this northern fjord, knew who was Sami and who was Norwegian. But to an outsider, they were indistinguishable. They spoke the same dialect, they looked the same, and they worked with the same things, and so on. And they applied for the same jobs, but everybody knew who was what. So he taught me something about the semiotics, of ethnicity as the exchange of signs, that kind of thing. So so we had I had some good teachers who have been a lasting influence.
Did you have a teaching system like I'm used to in Oxford and Cambridge, of a personal one-to-one, one-to-two supervisions of students on an essay or they've written, or was it in classes? And
at the time, no, we don't really. I mean, that's one of the problems, you might say, or one of the aspects of being a mass university and not an elite university, is that you have far larger numbers of students. And at the time we were about 50 who took the undergraduate program in social anthropology, which is not a terrible lot. I mean, the first year I taught in 1990 at this level, they were 300, but we were about 50, so that was not formally an option. We had lectures, and then we had seminar groups, which were led by advanced students. But informally, we got to know the teachers quite well, even during the first year. We organised our own little seminar groups. We could invite them out for coffee, and they could sit down with us. They had more time. They didn't go to conference all the time. They didn't have to publish 15 papers a year. So they had more time to devote to students. So we got to know them quite well, even though there were no formal arrangements of tutorials like they have at the best British universities.
One strand you didn't mention, you mentioned structuralism and so on, is Marxism. This is the high point of Marxist anthropology. Did that influence you much?
Well, yes and no.
Godelier and so on.
Yes and no. I think by the time I became a student in anthropology, we're talking about the early 80s, some of the steam had gone out of this Marxism. But in the 1970s, it led to deep frictions and tensions at our department, as in many other places, because you had these sort of die-hard, sometimes very dogmatic Marxists who really came to lectures really well prepared to take down the lecturer, who was a liberal bourgeois intellectual, that sort of thing. And some of the teachers never fully recovered from that onslaught, from clever, uncompromisingly hostile students. By the time I became a student, this had abated somewhat. I mean, yes, there was structural Marxism. And yes, I mean, we read Godelier, Meillassoux, and so on, and learned from them. But it was no longer, in a sense, obligatory to relate to them. So, no, I would say that by the time, by the early 80s, postmodernism somehow started to seep into anthropology in a way. And Geertzian hermeneutics, that kind of thing.
So you're reading Geertz?
Oh yes, we read everything, and that's one of the. I'm thinking that one of the advantages of being located in a semi-periphery is that you don't belong, as it were. You're not committed to one particular intellectual tradition. You can be more eclectic, which can be an advantage and a disadvantage. And in our case, it meant that we read just as much, but not just as much. I mean, we were still sort of a branch office of British social anthropology, I guess, with Frederick Marx, as a mother's brother in the lineage system. But we did read a lot of American anthropology. Geertz, Salins. I mean, one of the books that really mattered to me as an undergraduate was Culture and Practical Reason by Salins, which was not an easy read, but clearly, I mean,
very amusing.
Yes. But he was trying to move on. You notice that there was a sense in which he was trying to make things clear for himself regarding the relationship between the material and the symbolic and the autonomy of culture and the significance of symbols and so on. So that was a powerful influence on me at the time. So we read Geertz and Salins, and eventually, people like Eric Wolf and Sidney Mintz also were important to me, but mainly, the main tradition was that of British anthropology. But we also had French, not much German though.
Evans Richard?
Oh yes, absolutely, definitely. Everything by him, and of course I know Malinowski. The entire canon, Victor Turner, and I mentioned already Mary Douglas. So all of these people were considered pillars of the anthropological enterprise. The children of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown, and Jack Goody.
And Jack Goody,
absolutely,
yeah.
Production and reproduction, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I also, early as an undergraduate, I became interested in the kind of thing that I somehow have returned to now, namely information and communication technology. So
Marshall McLuhan, you mentioned a lot yesterday.
Yes, I did. Not quite an anthropologist, but he related to, he reviewed Margaret Mead's books. He did that sort of thing. But Jack Goody's work on literacy and the state. And one of the things that impressed me at the time was that Goody was able and willing, to work on a rather grandiose, ambitious comparative project. Unlike many anthropologists who were talking about comparison, but he never actually carried out any comparisons. And he did, he tried to say something substantial about literacy in different kinds of society. Yeah.
What about Lewis Mumford?
Yes.
He's one of my heroes, and when I think of McLuhan, I think of Mumford as well.
One must. There is an intellectual lineage there, quite clearly. And interestingly, McLuhan wrote mainly about media, and Mumford wrote mainly about cities. But they're all doing pretty much the same kinds of thing, aren't they? Yes. Yeah. Something about diversification, individualization, complexity.
So you finished your undergraduate degree, and then what do you do then?
Well, I decided to continue with anthropology. I did flirt for a while with the idea of doing a postgraduate degree in philosophy, and started very briefly, but then I realized that I'd already fallen in love with anthropology. And one reason was that in anthropology you could raise interesting philosophical questions, but engaging with people out there instead of just discussing amongst intellectuals, which I found a bit unsatisfactory. One other reason was that anthropology was the only subject that I knew about which was not Eurocentric, at least in theory, not Eurocentric in the sense that you see Europe as the center of the world. Sociology was very much about the study of industrial society. Philosophy was mainly the lineage from the Greeks onward in Europe, which is fine by itself, but I wanted something more. And in anthropology, what we tried to teach and what we learned at the time was that all human lives are interesting, and people in the village in New Guinea are just as interesting, and their lives are just as valuable as stockbrokers in Manhattan, neither more nor less. So there was this sort of symmetry which accorded everybody a place in the sun, which I found very attractive. And the third thing is that, you know, in the anthropology department, there was always someone who had just returned from the field and who had stories to tell. Right? So that could tell you something about the world and about the human condition. And I found all of this very attractive, so I decided to continue on my academic career, but in parallel I was doing other things. You know, I was writing already journalism for a monthly anarchist or libertarian, libertarian paper called Gatavisa, which means the street paper, which had a fairly good circulation at the time, 10,000–15,000, countercultural. You know, I wrote a lot about ecology. Eventually I wrote about some anthropologists like Gregory Bateson in it, but, and about music and about literature, and had a good time, you know, doing this on the side while I was also studying. And I had a part-time job as a night watchman in a hotel. It was a good job if you were able to stay awake, because nothing happened during the night, so they actually paid you just to sit there and read anthropology or do other things. So I had several interests. Went to concerts, very much into certain forms of music.
What music do you have you always liked?
Well, I've always liked classical music since my childhood. But then, you know, there's rock and there's jazz and progressive rock. You know, I soon became a bit, you know, into things such as, you know, progressive rock. I mean, the kind of groups which are called things such as Soft Machine and King Crimson and Genesis and so on from the early 1970s. So we went to concerts, and in fact I do play a bit of sax still, and I played in a prog rock band for a few years with mainly men my own age, having a good time. So we did this, and I also continued my studies in anthropology, and after a while I had to decide what to do for my MPhil. We had an MPhil system at the time, which entailed a full year of fieldwork. You know, not at the PhD, before the PhD level. A full year of fieldwork, and we wrote typically dissertations of 200–250 pages. It was almost like a doctoral thesis. So I had to decide on a place to go. And first I wanted to go to Kenya and to look at the relationship between the modern and the traditional sector in the economy, to put it bluntly. The way in which people migrated from the countryside into Nairobi to work in the formal economy, to perform wage work, and at the same time they would have a shamba, you know, a small farm somewhere in the countryside, which was tended to by their wife or wives and children. And I wanted to look at the relationship, not just in economic terms, but also in cultural terms, of this movement back and forth between something which was industrial, modern, individual, based on a labour contract and so on, and something which was based on a completely different set of cultural and economic premises. But just as I was about to finalise my plans for the fieldwork, there was a diplomatic crisis between Norway and Kenya. Very rare. I mean, this happens very rarely. And all the Norwegian aid workers and all the Norwegian agencies moved from Nairobi to Harare, because Zimbabwe was then still a place where it was feasible for them to be. So it would not have been possible for me to get the kind of permits I needed. So I really quickly needed to find a new place to do fieldwork. And I then stumbled across a book by V.S. Naipaul, which I hadn't read, a collection of essays called The Overcrowded Barracoon. And the title essay, The Overcrowded Barracoon, is Mauritius, where he had been briefly in the 1970s. And he described it as this sort of absurd place, you know, where people from all over the world are thrown together for no purpose, and it's overpopulated. There are ethnic tensions, and everybody just wants to get out. You know, that's a typical, you know, V.S. Naipaul's general sort of view of the world. You know, he always sees the glass as half empty. And there was also an interesting resonance that I would later exploit, in fact, in my later work in Trinidad, between the Caribbean history, Trinidadian history, and Mauritian history. So there were several things about Mauritius that titillated me, that awoke my curiosity, and not least the fact that it seemed as if it hadn't been explored much or studied much by anthropologists in the past. It's located on the wrong side of the Atlantic. It's not really part of the Caribbean, because it's in the Indian Ocean. But it is, in a sense, a Caribbean island located in the Indian Ocean in some ways. It's both French and English, so neither the French nor the English anthropologists had somehow laid claim to it. So the only major anthropologist who seemed to have worked in Mauritius at the time, this was mid-1980s, was Burton Benedict, who wrote about mainly Indians and mainly economic anthropology. So this seemed to be a good alternative. So I ended up going to Mauritius for my first proper fieldwork. Big adventure, and it changed my life.
Did it? In what way?
In many ways, because you see, I came from, you know, the kind of cultural identity that I came from when I was in my early 20s, early to mid-20s, was this kind of grim, pessimistic, post-industrial, post-punk kind of habitus, where everybody was very pale and we were always dressed in black, and we were listening to incredibly depressing music, and we generally agreed, and we read philosophers like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and generally agreed that life was probably meaningless. And we came from the most affluent place in the world, you know, Northern Europe, in the mid-1980s. And then I came to Mauritius, and I settled eventually in a fishing village. People had nothing. They were poor. They were living, you know, hand to mouth, basically. And they were, you know, they were positive about their lives. They were optimists. They were smiling. You know, they were cheerful. They were enjoying every little pleasure they could get. And coming to this place, and I mean, only after I think a week or so, I realised that there's no turning back to my former pessimism. You cannot simply countenance that after that experience. But it also changed my life in different ways, because Mauritius is a place where people of very different ethnic and religious identities, I mean, they live together in a very small, confined place, and generally without much friction. I'm not saying that they love each other, I'm not saying that there aren't any tensions, but they've found ways of living together which are viable and compatible with democracy, with economic growth, and with a high level of life satisfaction, I would say. So it changed my life in that way as well. It's really, I mean, that Mauritian experience, I spent a year there in 1986, it really shaped me, both intellectually and I guess personally. Yeah.
Did you get very close to any particular informants or families?
Yes, I did. I did get friends, and some of whom I am still in contact with, because I go back to Mauritius now and then. And today, with electronic communication, you know, you can be on text messages, you can be on Facebook with them, you can communicate with them in different ways. So I have a handful of very close and very old friends in Mauritius, some of whom I've known now for more than 30 years. And also some new friends, because they're now developing social science in very promising ways at the University of Mauritius. There was hardly anything at the time in 1986, and now it's thriving with sociology, economics, and very skilled people, some of whom have PhDs from South Africa or Europe. So yes, I did get quite close to people during that period. So it's one of the things that many people who are not anthropologists perhaps fail to recognize, is that you develop moral and existential commitments, which may be lifelong, to some of the people you work with in the field, because you get to know them personally, and that's part of our methodology. You use yourself, in a sense, as the research instrument. You don't have anything between you and the people you work with. So you can become very...
That's a nice definition of anthropology as becoming a musical instrument on which the culture plays. It was probably Geertz or something like that.
Probably, yes. Yeah, you might say that. Yes, I guess. So, and returning from Mauritius, even before returning, I started to correspond. You know, at the time we wrote handwritten letters. We didn't have computers in the way we do today. So I wrote to a couple of anthropologists in the UK whom I knew had an interest in. I'd already corresponded with Burton Benedict. He had lost interest in Mauritius, so he responded politely, but he didn't, you know, really engage in any enduring intellectual exchange. But I contacted Maurice Bloch and Adam Cooper. And Maurice Bloch, obviously he works in Madagascar, which is physically or geographically quite near, but culturally very different from Mauritius, because Mauritius is a place of migrants. It doesn't have any indigenous groups. But he had a student, a PhD student, who'd worked in Rodrigue, which is a dependency of Mauritius, with a Creole population. So he very kindly received me in his office at the LSE when I returned, because I was passing through London on my way home. And but Adam Cooper had a group of students. While he was at Leiden in the 80s, he had a group of students, MA students, who did short stints of fieldwork in Mauritius, just 3 months each, and published a small booklet based on that research. So I contacted Adam Cooper, who was by then already a big name in anthropology. Anthropology and anthropologists and several other publications to his name. And he incredibly, you know, generously invited me to his local pub on a Saturday afternoon in London, and we had a long chat about Mauritius and about other things. And so I've been in contact with him, and he's been supportive of my work since then. So I'm immensely grateful to Adam Cooper for this. I came as a young student, nobody knew about me, a master student in anthropology from Norway, who'd been to Mauritius, and he was so generous, intellectually and in every way.
That's a nice, heartening story. But you didn't get to do a PhD in England?
No, I didn't, but I never tried.
So you went on to do your PhD in Oslo? That's
right, I got the funding. So I graduated, I finished my MPhil, called Communicating Cultural Difference and Identity, about the relationship between ethnic identities and overarching national identity in Mauritius in 1987. And I briefly worked as an information officer with NORAD, with the Norwegian aid agency, while applying for a PhD fellowship. And then I got it. But I also applied for another job. You see, I still wasn't convinced that I would be an academic. And I applied for a job with a development agency in Tanzania, integrated village development. The idea was that it's not enough, you know, to build a school or to dig a well or to set up a small factory. You have to think holistically about village development. And that an anthropologist then, this idea attracted me. So I applied for the job, but I didn't get it. They gave it to a local instead, which was probably far better. The Tanzanian who would run the project. So I then applied for a PhD grant and got it. But of course, had I got this job in Tanzania, my life might have turned out very differently. But I then got the PhD fellowship and went on to do fieldwork in Trinidad.
Who was your supervisor?
That was still Axel Sommerfeld.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. But by then I had started, you know, to have conversations with other anthropologists as well, both in Norway and elsewhere. So I then got to know Fredrik Barth a bit, for example. I didn't really know him as a student, but during my PhD period I got to know him a bit. He was by then, you know, completing his book from Bali and starting, you know, to think about the possibility of doing something in Bhutan. But still very, you know, keen to discuss, very open-minded.
Yes, I was going to ask about his character. You said he was a charismatic lecturer, but otherwise open-minded and welcoming.
Yeah, very good listener, and far more open to diverse intellectual influences than many people think. Because in his writings he can seem a bit dogmatic sometimes, certainly in his early writings. But in my experience, you know, he read quite a bit. He didn't read everything as thoroughly as he might, but he had a really good overview of what was going on and a really strong intuition. You know, Fredrik he never did any really long fieldwork. I mean, he did fieldwork for maybe a few months, basically. Possibly one of his best books, Nomads of South Persia from around 1960.
Yeah.
It's based on 3 months of fieldwork, and he didn't speak the language, not much. And yet it's considered also by specialists in the field a really good book. So it shows that he had a great intuition, both as an observer, as a field worker. He knew what he was looking for and how to find it, and as a reader. So he had a good overview. So he was the one, for example, who recommended Bruno Latour and Steve Woolgar's laboratory life to us. So he said, this is something new, you should have a look at it. Maybe you can't use it, but read it. So, so a good conversational partner and a good listener, as well as obviously being a rather wise man, in fact.
So what was the theme of your work in Trinidad?
It was almost the same as in Mauritius, because the idea was, and that's also what I eventually ended up doing, to produce a comparative ethnography, comparative anthropology of Mauritius and Trinidad, where some things are similar, basically the same waves of migration. First slavery in the sugar industry, and then Indian indentureship, and even Chinese traders in both places, plus a small European elite known as French creoles in Trinidad. Of course, they don't speak French anymore, but still known as French creoles. So the idea was to make a comparison, because there are also some interesting differences. Trinidad is completely dominated by Afro-Caribbean culture, both in terms of numbers. The Afro-Caribbeans are the most numerous group, and also in terms of their geographical location, in this larger world of the Caribbean, whereas Mauritius is closer to India and far more isolated and has a larger proportion of its population of Indian origin. So these were some of the variables I was looking at when I was making these comparisons and discussing, again, the relationship between different forms of identification, really, and the ways in which people articulate similarity and difference in these complex societies, and to what extent they are capable of creating something resembling a shared identity, notwithstanding the very considerable diversity that you find. But what I did find in the end was that the cultural diversity is far less than one might expect. There is ethnic diversity. And again, the influence from my old teacher Harald Eidang, who had showed that in northern Norway, in fact, you could have fairly unequivocal, strict ethnic boundaries without there being much cultural variation. Same thing in a place like Trinidad. People have, to a great extent, the same culture but different identities, you might say. So I problematize some of these categories in anthropology and try to move on a bit from the paradigm posited in ethnic groups and boundaries. One of the things that is lacking, for example, in the book Ethnic Groups and Boundaries, 1969, which was major influence on studies of ethnicity almost everywhere. And one of the things that was lacking was an interest in or a concern with the state, which is almost absent, and also concerned with the anomalies, people who don't fit in, the groups that are neither this nor that. And especially in Trinidad, there's quite a large group known as Douglas, who are both African and Indian. They're neither this nor that, but they're both this and that at the same time. And what about them in a society which is obsessed with the boundary between the African and the Indian? And they're about 20% of the population. So so I was working with this kind of thing in my PhD. And the PhD it wasn't my finest hour. I mean, I must say, it's not my best piece of work. I published a collection of articles around the same time called Us and Them in Modern Societies, mainly articles which had been published elsewhere. It's 1992, which is much better than a dissertation. The dissertation is a bit chaotic, it's a bit unstructured, and I'm not too pleased with it now, but I passed. And my first opponent was Bruce Kapferer, and he was very supportive, which was flattering to me, of course. I mean, he liked it in spite of all its obvious shortcomings.
He was one of the examiners, was he?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And then you went into the job that you have held since.
Yes, yes, that's right.
You became a lecturer and professor.
Yeah, that's right. So I've stayed on in the same place forever, which is a bit strange in some ways, but that's the way things happen. So it's been a good place for me. But I should also say that one reason that I have stayed in Norway is personal, because I got married.
After the Trinidad?
Yes, this was, we're now talking about 1995. So I was by then settled at the University of Oslo, but I was thinking, seriously considering doing other things. And I was planning fieldwork in India, and had started to learn Hindi, had managed to get the funding, and was going to look at really at marriage strategies, or rather the marriage practices in an industrializing area in India. Thinking that it might be possible, at least that was one of the research questions or hypotheses, that something happens to marriage strategies when women start to work and when you get a more individualized labor market, as you do in industrial areas. So I located a place just outside of Delhi, which seemed appropriate. I'd been there, on a sort of a short visit, started to build contacts and started to learn Hindi. But I then met the woman who would become my wife, and we are still married happily so. And she's a publisher. So it turned out, she's not just married to me, she's also married to the Norwegian language. And so we've stayed in Norway.
You say she's a publisher. Does she run a publishing firm, or is she?
No, but she was the managing director of the largest publishing company in Norway for many years. So she just resigned from her job now, voluntarily, no conflict. She just wanted to do other things, but she was there, forever. So that's been part of the reason. But with globalization and with the new technologies, one finds that you can be quite connected. You can be part of a conversation everywhere, almost no matter where you are. So in the 1980s, I felt incredibly isolated up there in the far north, this cold and dismal, almost unpopulated place, and was thinking about going somewhere where it might be either pleasant or interesting to be. Brazil would be pleasant, Mauritius would be pleasant, Britain would be pleasant, South Africa would be both. And so I was thinking about these options, but nothing came of it at the time. And this was the 1980s. But then by the 1990s, I say even by the early to mid 1990s, we felt that with cheap calls, with the incipient internet, coming into the world, and with the increased ease of traveling, traveling became more frequent, cheaper, easier in every way. You no longer felt isolated. You could pop over somewhere for a conference. You could go somewhere just to meet someone, and you could be in contact electronically. So that has not. I've not felt that as a major obstacle, because one of the aspects of being in a small place is, they always say, is that you don't get the kind of intellectual impulses you need to develop. Yes, I know. There's also less pressure. There is pressure where we are, but probably less so than at Harvard or at Oxford. So there may be a case for the small, in the Midwest you have the teaching college, the liberal arts college, or the university, which is a little bit on the semi-periphery, where we have perhaps a little bit more elbow room in some ways. I'm relating this also to what I said earlier about being in a small place where you have the freedom to expose yourself to diverse intellectual influences, because you're not part of one very strong tradition, that there is a great expectation that you should defend and promote. I don't know if you agree with this.
As interviewer, I never intervened,
okay.
But I do. Of course, peripheral people are usually it's the University of Glasgow that changed the world, not the University of Oxford. A couple of sort of general final questions. One is, I associate you, among many good things, with being someone committed to making anthropology better known outside the academy, as it were, of anthropologists. I wondered why you did this, what had impelled you to do it, and if you could just explain a little bit of your work in that field.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think we should make anthropology, matter in many ways. And in most Western countries there are academics who are also public intellectuals, and I feel more of them should be anthropologists, or at least they don't have to be card-carrying anthropologists, but they should have an anthropological approach in the sense that you take the lives of ordinary people seriously. You are committed to making those stories heard that otherwise become are invisible, and that you have a kind of anthropological approach to the world, you might say, whereby, in the words of Malinowski, we try to make the exotic familiar and the familiar exotic. I think there is a job to be done there, not least in this time of frictions, tensions, migration and identity politics. So, and in the debates about human nature, which have almost been monopolized by evolutionary people, which what they say is fine, but it's only part of the truth, and we know that, and we should say so in so many words. So I think we have many discourses, many roles to play in public life, and we're underselling ourselves a bit by staying too much in our own seminar room talking amongst ourselves. So we should be maybe more sort of active and going out. And I've done this forever, not least because while I was a student, I already did some journalism, so I'm comfortable writing shorter pieces, which many of us are not, because it's a different register, it's a different way of communicating, because you talk in a different way to a different set of people who don't have a lot of time, who need to get the main points, you need to simplify sometimes. But of course, make it as simple as possible, but not simpler, as one might say. Be wary of not simplifying.
You know who said that?
I believe it would have been Albert Einstein.
It was.
Yes. But don't make it simpler, because there's far too much of that around. And we see that also in the popular literature on the human condition, where I often feel that anthropologists or people with an anthropological perspective would have done a better job. But that's how it is. So that's been one background for my own engagement. And I also came into anthropology and into really academic studies. Not only out of curiosity, but also out of a normative motivation. The idea, being that in order to change the world, you have to understand it first, as Marx famously said. So using knowledge also to try to make the world a slightly wiser and better place. Okay, so the way I've gone about it is by taking part in and contributing to newspapers, be part of radio program. I go on radio maybe once a week still, and sometimes on TV. And in a country like Norway, that's also a difference with a country like Britain. Since there are so few of us, each of us has to wear several hats. In a bid to contribute to population growth, you need to have several, as it were, identities in order to fill all the vacant niches. And as a result, some of us who are capable of talking on radio, are capable of, producing, as it were, coherent answers lasting no more than a minute or two to a question from a journalist, are being contacted quite often. And we sometimes have to leave our own comfort zone. So that if you're a specialist on ethnicity in Mauritius, and you've written about ethnic conflict, as I had in the early 90s, I was suddenly contacted when war broke out in Yugoslavia, because they felt that he should be able to comment on this as well. And I read up quickly on Yugoslavia and tried to do a decent job at it. But in a larger country, like Britain, there would have been dozens of experts on the Balkans to ask. But in Norway, there weren't at the time, not the right kind of experts. Yes, so I strongly feel that there should be a closer connection. We should do both. Obviously, we should do the slow and thorough stuff that we do. We should work with students the way we've always done, but we should also go out a bit and speak to other kinds of audiences. It has been said by a science fiction author who's also a friend of mine in Norway that the point about science is really about society sending out a probe into space. And it's meant to return after a while and tell us what it's found. And far too often, it says, we send out the probe and we have great expectations, but it never returns to tell us. It just stays out there.
in practical terms, you used journalism, television, radio. You also had quite an interesting website, as I recall. So you began to use the web as a way of disseminating.
Yeah, I did so quite early. I set up that website back in 1996.
Very early.
Yeah, so that's and it was very great fun. Put out little articles, try to engage people in discussions, and so on. And it's evolved and been transformed quite a bit since then. So it's at the moment my website looks far tidier, and I've had some professional help actually in its last incarnation. Someone who's redesigned it because I realised that it was just too much for me. So I've also started to work with, not like you, with video, but with a podcast. So I have a podcast now, mainly in Norwegian, but with a few entries in English, called Hylland's Verden, which means Highland's World. And the first 12 episodes, just completed this spring, the spring of 2019, are about the smartphone. So I've spoken to 12 different people, some of them extremely knowledgeable, some of them just interesting people who use smartphones, about their relationship to the smartphone and what it does to us. Yeah. And that's been a new kind of experience. So in this sort of polymedia world in which we live, my feeling is very strongly that we can think more creatively, more imaginatively about different ways of disseminating knowledge. Not at the detriment of producing thorough, authoritative, scientific knowledge, but there are so many uses to which that knowledge can now be put, thanks to the new technological possibilities. Everything from the blog and the podcast to the video interview that you're making, and to various kinds of writings. It doesn't have to be just an academic article and a book. So as I always tell students, if they've done a good MA, try to write an op-ed for a newspaper based on your MA, because there would be one in there that people deserve to know about. And one thing about living in Norway, it may be easier somehow to be a public intellectual in Norway than, for example, in Britain. Because in proportion to the population, we have far more media outlets, you see. So in a city like Oslo, with less than 1 million, we have 8 or 9 newspapers. So you'll find a place, where you can put your article. Someone will publish it, if it's not horrible.
Last question. If you were going to your desert island and you could take 1 or 2 of your books or articles with you as representing you at your best and most interesting, your legacy to which would you choose and why?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I've written so much, and I'm never 100% satisfied with anything that I've done. That's probably why I continue, because I think next time everything will fall into place. The thing that one of the things that I've been working on recently is accelerated change in general. The way in which economic change, technological change, cultural change in some domains takes place at an accelerated speed. So I'd probably bring the book called Overheating from 2016, which I think is representative of many of the things that I've done over the years. And possibly, I'm not sure about this, but my most widely read book is probably the introduction to anthropology called Small Places, Large Issues, which in fact I've written it about 7 times now. 3 Norwegian editions, 4 English editions. So probably the last.
That's had a huge influence, yes.
It's been translated, and it continues to be translated into new languages.
How did you write it? Did you just sit down and write it, or do you think about it a long time and then write it, or what?
Yeah, it was initially the Norwegian edition, which came first in 1993. It developed after conversation with a publisher who said, well, we need a new introductory textbook. We can't use Roger Keating anymore, which we had used when I was a student. And it was based partly on lectures that I'd given. I'd given lots of courses in the early 1990s, and obviously partly on other things, but that part of the structure comes in fact from my undergraduate lectures in anthropology. And then it had to be shortened a bit and tweaked a bit, and changed for the first English edition, and then it has somehow evolved, so the final English edition is as I said, it's the 7th incarnation of that book. So I might actually bring that as well, although it's not so much a representation of my own thinking as that of others.
But it's an excellent book, and it's an excellent interview, so thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you very much indeed for this opportunity.